August 12, 1847, Magnolia Creek Plantation, Mississippi Delta. Two cries split the midnight silence inside the great house, one child pale as ash moonlight, the other dark as the river clay that fed the cotton fields. Both born of the same mother, yet the sight of them together was enough to turn every candle's flame uneasy. By dawn, the colonel's wife lay trembling, the midwife fled without payment, and the colonel himself had vanished into the orchard with a pistol and a prayer he could not finish. Within 72 hours, 4 bodies would hang from the cypress trees. Within 2 weeks, 17 souls would vanish into the swamps, names struck from every ledger. County records for that month were sealed by order of the governor and would remain locked for 93 years. What they revealed about superfecundation, the science that might explain those twins, was nothing compared to what they concealed: the machinery of silence, the blood-stained politics, and the single confession that almost burned the Delta to ash. Before we step deeper into Magnolia Creek, make sure you are subscribed, because this story was never meant to be spoken. Comment your state or your country below. The truth buried here crosses borders you were taught to trust. Now listen closely. The summer that birthed the colonel's twin sons did not begin with labor pains or lightning over the Delta. It began 7 months earlier, with an act of calculation colder than winter iron, a decision carved from profit, power, and fear of God's eyes. The Colonel Richard Beaumont commanded 4,000 acres and 263 enslaved souls. His wealth was built on efficiency measured in lashes per bale. His faith was written in ledgers, not scripture. He had the bearing of a soldier, the speech of a politician, and the heart of an accountant dissecting human lives for yield. His wife, Catherine Stratford Beaumont, was raised on Charleston sugar and French manners. Her smile could freeze a ballroom, her silence could end a dinner. They were a union of dynasties, not love, but something unholy moved beneath their roof, a pulse neither plantation law nor church sermon could explain. And when those 2 boys took their first breath, one white, one black, the world that fed on silence began to scream. Type this phrase twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. I see what hides behind the gates, and I will not look away. The colonel returned to the house before sunrise, boots soaked in dew, pistol still warm. He stood at the foot of the bed where Catherine lay pale and trembling, the 2 infants swaddled beside her. For a long moment he said nothing, just watched. His eyes, those colorless gray mirrors, moved between the children like instruments weighing evidence. When he finally spoke, his voice was a blade drawn slow. Whose child is that? No one answered. The midwife had fled into the swamp hours before, leaving behind a trail of bloody linens and a single rosary bead crushed into the floorboards. Catherine's lips parted, but no sound came. The colonel stepped closer. He lifted the darker infant by the back of the neck, holding him up to the window's first light, studying him the way he might inspect a diseased calf. You will tell me, he said, or God himself will, but she didn't, not then. Not ever, not until the fires came months later, and the Confederacy of Silence began to tear itself apart. By mid-morning, Magnolia Creek was already shifting. Servants moved like ghosts, whispering of curses, of witches, of punishment. In the quarters, word spread faster than wind. The mistress had birthed a black child, the colonel's bloodline poisoned. Some said the devil had lain with her. Others said justice had. Either way, everyone knew something would break before the week was done. The colonel ordered both infants hidden from sight until God sorted the matter. He locked them in the east nursery, the windows nailed shut. He summoned the county doctor, a man known less for medicine than for discretion. The doctor took one look at the boys and wrote in his notes, "A phenomenon of nature, unfit for public record." Catherine spent those days drifting between numbness and panic. She watched the twins sleep, one face like hers, the other echoing someone she dared not name, and felt the weight of her own creation pressing her toward madness. In her dreams, she saw the 2 infants lying side by side, and the river rising through the floorboards to carry one away. Outside, the cotton fields shimmered under the brutal sun, unaware that Magnolia Creek had just given birth not to 2 sons, but to a curse that would not die. By the 3rd night, the colonel had made his decision. It came to him not in prayer, but in silence, the kind only men who believe they are God can endure. He ordered the darker child taken away before dawn. No ceremony, no baptism, no name. Just a quiet removal from the record. Klaus Hoffmann, the overseer, carried out the order. He took the infant in a burlap cloth and walked into the fog-bound fields toward the slave quarters. When he returned, his hands were empty. The colonel never asked where the child had gone, and Hoffmann never told. The official record would later claim that one of the twins perished during the night from complications of birth. But everyone at Magnolia Creek knew that was a lie carved clean. Catherine did not scream. She simply stopped speaking altogether. Her silence became the haunting that followed every corridor. She moved through the great house like a revenant, always listening, always waiting for the sound of a child that no longer cried. The other baby, the pale one, thrived under the colonel's obsessive watch. Every breath measured, every blink recorded. The heir to the Beaumont dynasty, pure in blood and purpose. But the land began to shift. Strange things happened in the fields after the disappearance. Oxen refused to plow certain furrows. Lanterns flickered and went out near the riverbank. One morning, Hoffmann found a wooden cradle half buried at the edge of the swamp, rocking though there was no wind. Inside it, carved into the wood, were the words, "He still breathes." The enslaved workers whispered that the missing twin had been hidden, protected by the people he was meant to own. That Catherine's tears had marked him as sacred, that he was being raised in secret among them, destined to rise against his father's cruelty. The colonel dismissed such talk as superstition, but his hands shook when he signed his ledgers. His fields yielded less that season. Though the weather had been perfect, his men grew restless, his wife unreachable. And somewhere in the swamp a cry echoed on windless nights, a cry that sounded too human to be animal, too young to be ghost. Magnolia Creek had begun to rot from within, and no sermon, no bullet, no prayer would stop it. The first death came quietly. Klaus Hoffmann, the overseer who had carried the darker twin into the swamp, was found 3 days later at the edge of the cotton fields. His body hung from a persimmon tree, eyes swollen, tongue blackened, boots missing. The colonel declared it suicide, though no man in the county believed that. His hands were bound behind his back. His knees were torn open from being dragged. When the plantation preacher came to bless the corpse, the wind shifted suddenly and scattered the hymn book pages across the rows of cotton like white birds, fleeing something unseen. From that moment on, every worker on Magnolia Creek knew the missing child had not died. He had claimed his first soul. Catherine began to unravel. At night she would wander barefoot through the halls, whispering lullabies to shadows. Servants swore they saw her in the east nursery, kneeling before an empty cradle, singing soft and low until sunrise. Once the colonel caught her there. Her hands were trembling over the sheets, her eyes hollow. "He's hungry," she said. "You left him in the dark, and now he feeds." The colonel struck her so hard she fell against the wall. He locked the nursery and forbade anyone from speaking the word child in her presence. But silence does not erase guilt, it breeds it. Soon fires began to break out in the quarters. Small at first, a storage shed, a barn. But each flame seemed to find its way toward the big house, creeping closer each night. The enslaved people moved like shadows, avoiding eye contact, muttering prayers in tongues the colonel could not name. He doubled the patrols. He issued whippings for anyone found outside after dark. Yet the fires kept coming. One evening, the colonel awoke to the sound of crying, the unmistakable cry of a newborn, drifting from the swamp beyond the orchard. He grabbed his rifle and stormed into the darkness, shouting, cursing, demanding whoever hid there to show themselves. But the deeper he went, the louder the sound became, until it surrounded him. When dawn came, the colonel returned without his rifle, covered in mud and trembling. He told no one what he'd seen. But from that day forward, the man who ruled Magnolia Creek began to fear his own blood. The days turned heavy and strange. Even the air seemed different, thicker, charged, humming with something unseen. The cotton refused to bloom, though the weather stayed kind. Animals grew restless, dogs howled at the same hour every night. And Catherine began to speak again, but not to her husband nor to the living. She talked to the walls, to the cradle that stood empty in the east nursery, to the reflection of her own face in the window pane when moonlight struck it just right. The maids heard her whispering a name they did not recognize. One, she said, came to her in dreams, Josiah. When the colonel confronted her, she did not weep or flinch. She only said, "You cannot bury what breathes beneath your house." That night, she asked to be left alone in her chambers. When morning came, the door was still locked. The servants forced it open and found her sitting upright in bed, her nightgown soaked in sweat, her eyes open but unmoving. On the wall behind her, written in ash, were 4 words, "Hay knows the truth." The colonel burned the sheets, scrubbed the walls, buried her rosaries under the oak. But he could not erase the message. It lived in his mind, repeating in every sound he heard. The creak of the floors, the cry of cicadas, the rustle of chains at dawn. He called for Reverend Haskins, the traveling preacher known for cleansing haunted grounds. The Reverend arrived with 3 Bibles, 2 crucifixes, and a voice full of thunder. He preached fire through the quarters, called for repentance, and swore he could cast out whatever darkness had settled on Magnolia Creek. On the 3rd night of his sermon, as he shouted about sin and punishment, the lamps blew out all at once. The church fell into darkness, and from the back of the room came a sound that froze every heart inside. A child's laugh, soft and wet, like the echo of something still learning how to breathe. The Reverend fled that night and never returned. His horse was found at sunrise near the riverbank, its saddle torn and its reins missing. And in the colonel's study, lying upon his ledger book, was a single black handprint, small enough to belong to a newborn. By October, Magnolia Creek was no longer a plantation. It was a wound that refused to close. The colonel stopped sleeping. He patrolled the halls at night with a lantern and his revolver, convinced the sound of infant laughter was following him. He ordered the servants to keep every candle lit, even through the day, and forbade anyone from entering the east wing. Still, the shadows grew longer. The men in the fields whispered that the missing child had survived, that he lived among them now, hidden, protected by those who'd sworn vengeance for every lash the colonel had ever ordered. They said he bore his mother's eyes and his father's rage. They said he would return on the anniversary of his birth to claim what was his. Some of the older slaves began leaving small offerings near the well. Cornbread, carved dolls, bits of ribbon. The colonel called it witchcraft and ordered the offerings burned. But the very next morning, a dead bird appeared on his doorstep, its wings pinned open, its beak filled with cotton. When he demanded who had done it, no one spoke, so he chose 3 men at random and had them whipped until the blood turned the dirt to clay. That night, the laughter returned, louder, closer. It echoed through the rafters from inside the walls, until even the soldiers he hired to guard the property begged to leave. Meanwhile, Catherine drifted between sanity and surrender. She wrote letters to the child she believed was still alive, though no ink touched the paper. She claimed she could feel his heartbeat through the floors. "He is near," she whispered to her maid, "and when he comes, none of us will be spared, least of all me." The colonel began to see things: footprints in the ash of the fireplace, damp handprints on the window glass, and sometimes, just for a breath, a figure standing at the edge of the orchard, small and still, half hidden by fog. He would shout, aim his pistol, and fire into the mist. But when he reached the spot, the ground was untouched except for 2 sets of footprints, one of a man's, and one that could only belong to a child. Magnolia Creek had ceased to belong to the living. The first whispers of revolt began not with anger, but with songs, low, rhythmic, mournful hymns that drifted from the quarters after sundown, melodies that spoke of freedom and vengeance in equal measure. The colonel forbade music, but the songs returned every night, stronger, closer. He heard them in his dreams, the rhythm matching the beating of his heart until he could no longer tell one from the other. Each dawn brought new signs: a plow left upright in the field, shaped like a cross. Tools found rusted overnight, though the sky had been dry. A newborn calf born with eyes pale grey, like the colonel's own. Every omen whispered one truth: something beneath Magnolia Creek was stirring, something that would not rest. The enslaved workers began to vanish one by one. Some said they fled to the swamps, forming a secret camp led by the boy the colonel had tried to erase. Others claimed they were taken by spirits guarding him. Either way, the fields grew empty, and the colonel's profits withered like his sanity. At night, Catherine heard the songs too. She sat by her window, her hair unbound, her eyes hollow. She whispered, "He's coming home." When her husband tried to silence her, she only smiled soft, knowing, almost kind. "You'll hear him before you see him," she said. "A cries like a newborn, but he walks like a man." But the colonel struck her again, this time hard enough to split her lip. "I buried that child," he roared. "I buried him myself." From the corner of the room, a sound rose, a soft cooing, unmistakable. Catherine didn't flinch. "Then tell me," she whispered through the blood. "Whose voice is that?" The colonel fired a shot into the wall. The echo rolled through the house like thunder. When the smoke cleared, the nursery door, locked for months, was standing wide open. Inside, the cradle rocked gently, though no wind stirred. By morning, half the field hands were gone. The overseer's house stood empty, his ledger burned to ash, and at the gates of Magnolia Creek, carved into the wood with a blade, were the same 4 words that had once appeared on Catherine's wall: "Hay knows the truth." The war for Magnolia Creek had begun, and its first casualty would be its master. The night the revolt began, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. No crickets, no frogs, no wind through the cane, only stillness, heavy and waiting. The moon hung low, red as rust, and the fog rolled off the swamp like smoke from a slow-burning fire. The colonel sat alone in his study, a bottle of bourbon trembling in his grip. His uniform still hung behind the door, pressed and perfect, a relic of a war he had never fought. On the desk before him lay his pistol, a Bible, and a single letter from Catherine that he had never opened. The house was too quiet. Even the servants had disappeared. Then came the first sound, a faint tapping against the window. Once, twice, 3 times. He turned, expecting a branch, but saw instead the outline of a small hand pressed against the glass from the outside. A child's hand, pale, wet, trembling. Before he could move, it was gone. Moments later, the bells of the quarters began to ring, wild, uneven, desperate. A fire bloomed on the horizon, the glow painting the sky in orange and black. The colonel stumbled to his feet and looked out across his empire. His fields were burning, his barns collapsing. And through the flames he saw them, men and women emerging from the smoke, torches in hand, faces streaked with soot and fury. They moved like ghosts, silent but certain, their eyes reflecting the firelight like glass. At their center, half in shadow, stood a boy no older than 10, his skin the color of river silt, his hair tangled, his eyes gray as the colonel's own. The colonel's heart stopped. For a moment, he thought the bourbon had poisoned him, that this vision was madness. But when the boy raised his hand, the fire obeyed, bending in a slow, unnatural sway, as if the flames themselves answered his call. Catherine appeared behind the colonel, barefoot, her nightdress soaked through with sweat. She touched his shoulder gently. "You see," she whispered, "you tried to kill your sin. But sin doesn't die, it inherits." Outside, the boy stepped closer, the fire parting for him like a curtain. And when his voice rose above the crackling blaze, it was not the cry of a child. It was the voice of judgment. "Father," he said, "do you remember where you buried me?" The mansion erupted before the colonel could even reach the front steps. The air shuddered with the sound of splintering wood, the clash of metal, and the low, thunderous rhythm of boots pounding the earth. The enslaved had come for him, not with hesitation but with the fury of generations. Torches cut through the darkness like veins of molten light, and behind them came the boy, calm, silent, his eyes fixed on the house that had once been his tomb. The colonel fired into the night blindly, wildly, each shot swallowed by the roar of flames. The bullets hit nothing. Shadows moved through the smoke, figures he could not name, faces he could not see. He backed up the stairs, pistol shaking, shouting for Catherine. But she was already there, standing in the doorway above him, her white gown glowing like a ghost's veil. "They are not here for me," she said softly. "They are here for you." The colonel aimed the pistol at her, but his hand refused to obey. It trembled, pulled down by something unseen. His knees buckled. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the woman he'd married, but the one he'd broken, her beauty hollowed out, her eyes filled with quiet fire. "I loved him," she said, "and he loved me, not as a mistress, not as property, but as the woman you never saw." The colonel's voice cracked. Who was he? She stepped closer, close enough for him to see the tears cutting through the suit on her cheeks. "The man you whipped for looking at me too long. The one who carried your son into the swamp when you ordered him killed." Outside, the doors burst open. The people flooded in, faces lit by firelight, the weight of centuries in their eyes. And in their midst, the boy came forward, each step echoing with the rhythm of the burning earth. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at the man whose blood ran in his veins. "Your name is Richard Beaumont," he said. "Mine is Josiah. You took my breath once. I have come to return it." The wind rose and every candle in the house went out. The flames outside surged higher, swallowing the porch, the walls, the legacy of Magnolia Creek itself. And for the first time, the colonel fell to his knees. The house was an inferno now, its pillars cracking, its roof sighing like a dying beast. Smoke coiled down the grand staircase, wrapping around the colonel and his son like a serpent that had waited decades to strike. Josiah stood at the foot of the stairs, the fire casting a trembling halo around his small frame. The flames did not touch him. They bent away as though afraid. Catherine moved between them, her face glowing in the firelight, her voice trembling but clear. "Enough," she whispered. "This house has already eaten enough souls." But Josiah did not look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the man who had buried him, his father, his executioner. The colonel reached for his pistol, but his hand would not close around it. His fingers spasmed useless. His knees hit the floor with a dull crack. For the first time, he looked small, just an old man gasping for air in the house his cruelty built. "Do it," he rasped. "If you are mine, then finish what I started." The Josiah took another step forward. The floorboards blackened under his bare feet. His voice, when it came, was calm, almost tender. "You started a curse, not a life. You taught men to count souls like bales of cotton. You made my mother a ghost long before she died. You don't deserve my hands." The boy looked to Catherine. "He belongs to you." A tears cut down her face as she knelt beside the man who had destroyed her. "I prayed for your soul," she whispered. "But God stopped listening the night you buried our child." She reached for the pistol lying at his knee. The colonel didn't resist. He just closed his eyes. The shot was soft, almost merciful. The sound vanished into the roar of the burning roof. Catherine dropped the gun, her body shaking. Josiah reached out his small hand, brushing her cheek. "You freed us," he said. "Now go." She nodded, eyes glassy, and walked through the fire. The boy followed her, and the flames parted for them like a sea. By dawn, Magnolia Creek was ash. The fields were smoke. Of the great house, only the east wing remained, a cradle of stone, blackened but standing. And inside its walls, some swore they still heard a lullaby, soft, endless, waiting. When the fire finally died, Magnolia Creek was nothing but bones, charred beams, cracked stone, the ghosts of an empire turned to dust. The sky hung grey for days, the smoke carried down river until even the next parish could smell the ruin. But amid the ash, stories began to grow. Some said a woman and a boy were seen walking along the levee at dawn, their silhouettes pale against the rising sun. Others swore they vanished into the cypress swamp, never to be seen again. But everyone agreed on one thing: the land was not dead. It was awake. The governor sent men to investigate, but they found no bodies. Only the colonel's pistol, half melted, beside the cracked hearth where he had fallen. On the wall above it, scorched into the plaster by the heat, were 5 words, burned deep, like they had been written in fire itself. "Blood remembers what men forget." Within weeks, the plantation's soil turned barren. Nothing grew where the big house once stood. The few who tried to rebuild fell sick or disappeared. The overseer's family fled north, claiming the cries of a child echoed every night just before dawn. Even the crows avoided the fields. But miles away, in a freedman's settlement near Vicksburg, a young boy began to appear on Sunday mornings, quiet, watchful, sitting in the back pew of the wooden church. His name was Josiah, though he never gave a last name. He worked in the fields by day, taught others to read by lantern light at night. The elders said he carried something in him, something powerful, something older than sin or skin. They called him the Heir of the Ashes. As he grew, Josiah never spoke of Magnolia Creek, but whenever a child cried in hunger, food would appear by sunrise. When a fever swept the camp, the sick would wake healed by morning, And sometimes, when lightning struck near the river, people claimed to see the shadow of a boy standing in the storm, untouched by rain, his eyes burning grey through the dark. The curse of Magnolia Creek had not ended. It had changed shape, born again through the one soul the Colonel tried to erase. And in every whisper, every prayer, one warning remained: don't bury truth, it learns to walk. By 1858, 11 years after the fire, the name Josiah had spread far beyond the delta. No one knew exactly where he lived, but everyone, slave and master alike, knew his story. They called him the boy who survived the burning house, the fire that walks, the child the river couldn't drown. In whispers carried through the cotton rows and the midnight swamps, his name became a prayer. Josiah, keep us. The women said before sleep. Josiah, watch. The men muttered before the whip came down. Songs rose from the quarters, low, trembling, dangerous. They spoke of a child who could not die, whose blood carried the memory of every broken chain. And in those same years, strange things began to happen. Plantations burned from within. Overseers were found with their throats cut, their ledgers missing, chains disappeared. Masters woke to empty fields. The authorities called it uprising. The old ones called it reckoning. Some claimed to have seen him, a young man, tall and lean, eyes grey as stormlight, appearing on nights when the moon was red. He never spoke much, only asked one question before the fire began: do you remember Magnolia Creek? The planters who heard those words never survived to answer. Meanwhile, in the small freedmen's camp near Vicksburg, Josiah's legend grew in quieter ways. He became a teacher, a healer, a keeper of stories. He refused leadership but drew followers all the same. They said he carried an old book, wrapped in cloth, written in two hands, his mother's and his father's. Inside were the names of every soul who had lived and died on the plantation, every name the Colonel had tried to erase. And as the country edged closer to war, those who had once been enslaved began to gather around Josiah. Not with banners, not with muskets, but with fire, memory, and faith. He told them, freedom does not come from the north. It comes from the ground beneath our feet, the ground that remembers. The same year, an anonymous letter reached the Mississippi Tribune. It read only, the blood of Magnolia Creek walks again. And this time, it walks for all of us. No one ever traced the author. But the ink was smudged, grey like ash and river water mixed together. When the war finally came, it did not arrive in thunder or glory. It came quietly like rot under painted wood. 1861. The Delta slept under a veil of heat and prophecy. The Colonel's old house stood empty, its columns cracked, its windows blind. No one lived there now. But at night, watchers swore they saw a candle burning in the upper nursery. By then, Josiah was 20. No longer a boy, not yet something mortal. He had vanished into the swamps 6 months before the first shot at Fort Sumter. Some said he joined the Union lines under a false name. Others said he was building an army of his own, one that answered not to any flag, but to memory itself. Plantations began to fall silent across the delta. Fields unworked. Overseers fled. White men whispered of an unseen rebellion, not the kind fought with rifles but with fear. Livestock found dead. Tools rusted overnight. Crops blackened without cause. The slaves had begun to whisper one word when they passed each other at night: Creek. That was all. Creek. It was enough. Josiah's mother, Catherine, was said to have died years before. But there were those who swore she was seen walking the riverbanks at dusk, her hair grey and loose, her dress the color of morning fog. They said she spoke to no one, only watched the water as if waiting for something or someone to surface. When Union forces finally reached Issaquah County in 1863, they found Magnolia Creek reduced to black bones of timber and charred iron. In the ashes of what had been the nursery, they found 2 small marble headstones half buried. One read Margaret, the other unnamed son, but there was no grave beneath it, only air. Rumors spread among the soldiers that something watched them at night, something that left footprints in the mud, that filled with water and then with blood. A few wrote home about it, in letters that never reached their families. They called it the River Child. One corporal wrote, "He looks like a man but moves like smoke. When he speaks, the crickets stop singing." The letter was dated August 12, 1863, exactly 16 years after the night the twins were born. The corporal's unit disappeared 3 days later. After the war, Mississippi became a graveyard of ghosts, some buried, others walking. The soldiers who survived Magnolia Creek refused to speak of what they saw. When pressed, they said the river fog there never lifted, even in daylight. One man claimed it took the shape of a woman cradling two children, one pale, one dark, both whispering the same word over and over, remember. The plantation's ruins became a forbidden place. Locals said that anyone who set foot beyond the broken gates would hear babies crying in the night, followed by the steady sound of a man's footsteps pacing the nursery above. Farmers avoided the land. The cotton never grew there again. It was as if the earth itself had made a decision: no more blood, no more chains. But while the house decayed, Josiah's name did not. Freedmen who could not read passed his story mouth to mouth, like a sermon stripped of scripture, but rich with power. They said he never died. They said he walked north after the burning, carrying a book written by two hands, one white, one black, and that wherever he opened it, something in the air changed. A wind would rise, a silence would follow, and the hearts of those who heard it would wake as if from 100-year sleep. By 1870, Josiah's name had become part of a secret hymn sung in the invisible churches, the hidden gatherings where freedmen worshipped away from white eyes. Josiah walks, they sang in low voices. Josiah walks the water. When the river turns red, the chains will break. White ministers condemned the song as superstition, but the hymn spread like fire. Children learned it before they learned to pray. Some said Josiah himself appeared at one such gathering near Natchez, a tall man with eyes like grey ice, who said only, "The blood remembers." Then he vanished into the crowd. No one could ever prove it was him. But that night, lightning struck the steeple of the church that had once belonged to the Connells' kin. It burned to the ground in silence, the flames unnaturally blue. A freedwoman named Ruth LaGrange, who'd lost her husband at Magnolia Creek, wrote in her journal, "The Lord may have freed us." But Josiah woke us. And for generations, the name Josiah would mean one thing in the Delta: reckoning. A century passed, but the earth at Magnolia Creek never healed. Locals built roads around it, not through it. Maps marked it only as private property, though no one could ever say who owned it. The government fenced it off after World War II, claiming it was unstable ground, but old folks in Issaquah County whispered that wasn't the reason. They said men in suits came once every few years, carrying shovels, cameras, and machines that hummed low like bees. They never stayed past sundown. In 1962, a young historian from Jackson named Harold McKinnon tried to document the legend for his dissertation. He found newspaper clippings, faded sermons, and a list of names from the plantation's ledger. At the bottom of the list, written in different ink, were 5 words: "The blood still walks below." McKinnon visited the site that same summer. He never returned. His car was found on the edge of the creek, engine running, doors open, headlights still burning through the fog. His camera was recovered days later downstream. Its final photograph blurred, but visible through the distortion was what looked like a tall figure standing amid smoke, holding something that reflected the light like a mirror. That photograph was locked away in the state archive. When it was reopened decades later, the negative was gone. By the 1980s, the government had declared Magnolia Creek a flood control zone. They dug a canal, rerouted the river, and buried the ruins beneath layers of clay and silence. But during the dig, workers unearthed fragments of stone, marble, scorched and carved with 2 names: Margaret and unnamed son. The foreman ordered the pieces sealed and removed before anyone could photograph them. That night, a storm struck from a clear sky. Floodwaters swallowed the machinery, the records, and one of the workers, a man who, according to his brother, had laughed at the story of Josiah earlier that day. When the waters receded, the canal was gone. The river had taken it back. Now, if you drive through that part of Mississippi, the GPS flickers and fails. Locals warn travelers not to stop after dark. They say the fog rolls in from nowhere, and sometimes, if you listen close, you can hear the sound of chains breaking, soft, steady, and far away. And in that moment, you'll know Josiah still walks. In 2023, a construction crew clearing ground for a new highway near the Yazoo River made a discovery that was never meant to see daylight. Beneath layers of clay and river silt, they found a rusted iron chest, sealed with melted wax and wrapped in what appeared to be scorched parchment. Inside lay documents preserved almost perfectly, pages of elegant handwriting, a broken pocket watch, and a single gold locket containing 2 locks of hair, one blonde, one black. The papers were sent to the Mississippi Historical Society for cataloging. What they revealed was not plantation records nor war logs, but a private diary belonging to Connell Whittaker, dated 1846 to 1848. The entries began as expected, reports of harvest, debts, and discipline. But as the pages turned, the writing shifted. It became fractured, haunted. The Connell described dreams of a fire that would not burn out, and a child born from 2 worlds, one of shadow, one of shame. The final entry was written on the night of the house fire. The ink was smudged, but legible enough to read his last words. The boy bears both my blood and my sin. He will be my end. He carries the name of the river and the flame. If he lives, may he remember what I forgot. At the bottom of the page, in a handwriting not the Connell's, smoother, deliberate, were 5 words identical to those on the Plantation ledger and McKinnon's notes a century later. The blood still walks below. Experts confirmed the ink came from a later decade, the 1870s, which meant someone else had opened that diary after the Connell's death. Someone who had lived long enough to read it. The locket found inside the chest was examined last. When opened, it contained a faded scrap of paper tucked behind the hair. A single line written in grey pencil for Margaret, for my mother, for the fire that never died. The chest and its contents were taken to Washington for further study, but before they could be displayed, the archives suffered an unexplained power failure. Security footage from that night showed only a brief flicker. A figure standing at the end of the corridor, tall, motionless, haloed in light, then darkness. When the power returned, the chest was gone. Only one thing remained on the table where it had rested, a fresh trail of river mud, and written in it, with a single finger, the blood remembers. Weeks after the disappearance of the Magnolia Creek chest, whispers began circulating online, not through mainstream outlets, but in dark corners of forums dedicated to American mysteries. Someone claiming to be a night guard at the Washington Archive posted a single, chilling message. I came back for what was his. You could smell the river in the air. The post was deleted within hours. The account vanished the next day, but it sparked something, a wave of obsession. People began visiting the old site of Magnolia Creek, ignoring warnings from locals. They brought drones, cameras, and EMF readers, hoping to capture proof of the legend. Most found nothing but thick fog and silence, yet a few returned with footage they couldn't explain. The faint outline of a figure walking across the water, moving against the current. No sound. No reflection. Just motion. A paranormal researcher named Grace Holloway, who'd studied slave folklore for 2 decades, released a documentary on the case. She traced the phrase, "The blood still walks below," across centuries. From the original plantation ledgers to coded messages found in black spirituals and even church carvings from the Reconstruction era. Her conclusion chilled everyone who watched. Josiah wasn't just a man. He became the language of survival. A ghost that carried history when no one else would. Every generation buried him deeper. But you can't bury memory. It learns to breathe through the soil. 2 months later, Holloway disappeared. Her camera crew found her equipment abandoned near the banks of the Yazoo River. The last thing she recorded was audio, 40 seconds of wind, followed by the sound of water lapping gently. Then a low voice whispered something impossible to forget. The blood remembers. Forensic analysis confirmed the voice wasn't human. It contained frequencies outside normal vocal range, tones closer to thunder than speech. Today, Magnolia Creek is still off limits. Fences rust, signs fade, and the fog rolls thicker each year. But travelers say if you drive that stretch of road between Vicksburg and Isquina just before dawn, you'll see lights in the mist, like candles, floating in a line, moving toward the river. And if you listen closely, you might hear the hymn rise again. Soft, steady, ancient, carried on the same wind that once whispered his name. Josiah. I wasn't supposed to be there. That's what kept running through my mind the night I crossed the rusted fence at Magnolia Creek. It was late, too late, and the fog was thicker than I'd ever seen. My flashlight could barely cut through it. The air smelled of wet iron and magnolia blossoms, sweet and rotting at once. I'd spent months studying Josiah's legend, the diaries, the burned ledgers, the vanished researchers. Every trail led here, to this forgotten bend in the Yazoo River where the land itself seemed to breathe. I didn't believe in ghosts, not really, but I believed in history, and I knew some stories refuse to die until they are heard again. The ground was soft beneath my boots, waterlogged. The air felt heavy, like the weight of 100 unspoken names pressing against my chest. Then I saw it, the faint outline of the old foundation stones, the charred skeleton of what had once been the Connells' house. And there, half buried in mud, something glinted, a brass plate, faded, etched with words barely legible beneath centuries of corrosion. Magnolia Creek Plantation, established 1821. When I brushed the dirt away, I noticed something underneath. Another engraving, rough, carved by hand. It read, "He still walks." That's when I heard it, a chain dragging somewhere far off, slow and deliberate. Then the soft sound of water rippling against bare feet. I turned, light shaking in my hand. A figure stood by the riverbank, tall, motionless, eyes like grey fire reflecting the beam. He didn't move toward me. He just watched. The fog swirled around him like smoke, and for a moment I thought I saw others behind him. Silhouettes of men and women, their heads bowed, their hands linked, faces both sorrowful and serene. I wanted to speak, but no words came. Then he raised his hand, pointed toward the water, and whispered, or maybe the air itself whispered through him, "Remember." A wave of warmth rushed through me, grief, rage, forgiveness, all at once. And then he was gone. The fog thinned, the river was still, but when I looked down, my boots were standing in muddy water that rippled outward, shaped like footprints walking away from me, back toward the river, back toward the past, and the whisper lingered, soft as breath. The blood remembers. I left Magnolia Creek before dawn. The fog followed me for miles, curling through the pine trees like it refused to let go. By the time I reached the highway, the sun was rising, bleeding red across the sky. The same red I'd read about in those old hymns: when the river turns red, the chains will break. I told myself it was all imagination, a trick of exhaustion, the mind reaching for ghosts when it's too tired to reason. But when I stopped for gas in Vicksburg, the clerk, an old man with silver hair and river-gray eyes, looked up at me and said quietly, "You've been to the creek, haven't you?" I froze. "How do you know that?" I asked. He smiled, slow and sad. "You smell like it," he said, "like rain on ash." Then he slid something across the counter. A folded piece of parchment yellowed with age. "I was told to give this to whoever comes back from there," he said. I opened it. Inside was handwriting I recognized instantly. Elegant, deliberate, the same as in the Colonel's diary. But this wasn't the Colonel's hand. It was smoother, younger. The signature read simply J. The note said, "If you have seen the river, then you already know." The story was never mine alone. It belongs to every name that was taken, every voice that was silenced. When the earth breathes, listen. When the water stirs, remember. The blood walks where memory dares not go. J. When I looked up, the old man was gone. The store was empty. Only the faint smell of magnolia blossoms remained, and the sound of chains breaking far away like echoes inside the wind. That night, I placed the parchment beside my notes. When I woke the next morning, the ink had changed. The words were the same, but written beneath them, in wet grey strokes that hadn't been there before, was a final line. "You wrote this too. I don't know what it means." Maybe the story never ends because it isn't a story at all. It's a reckoning, living, breathing, waiting. And every time someone speaks Josiah's name, the ground at Magnolia Creek stirs again. Because some bloodlines don't die. They remember. It's been 6 months since I left Magnolia Creek. 6 months since that night when the fog spoke my name and the river seemed to breathe. I told myself I'd move on. File my notes, publish the story, let history have the final word. But history doesn't stay quiet, not when it's written in blood. At first, it was small things. My house lights flickering at 3:16 a.m., the exact minute the Colonel's house burned in 1847. The smell of river mud in my hallway after rainless nights. My computer turning on by itself. The cursor typing slow and deliberate. The blood remembers. I stopped sleeping. I started hearing the hymn, faint like a hum under the world. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps outside my window, soft but certain, pacing the way the Colonel once did before the fire. I tried to leave it behind, but last week, a package arrived at my door, no return address. Inside was a flash drive labeled simply below. I hesitated for hours before opening it. Inside was a single video file. The screen flickered, showing the banks of the Yazoo at night. The camera was shaking, but the sound was clear. Wind, water, chains, and then a voice I knew too well. My own, whispering words I never remembered saying. He walks still. The footage ended with a frame of the river, dark and still, until something rose slowly from the water. A man's reflection, his face half in shadow, his eyes grey as stormlight. Then, static. I haven't shown it to anyone. I don't think I will, because I finally understand what Josiah meant. His story was never about vengeance. It was about inheritance. We inherit what was buried. The guilt, the sorrow, the truth. Every generation digs it up again. Every generation must decide whether to look away or remember. Tonight, the fog is rolling in again. The same kind that haunted the creek. I can hear the low hum of the hymn through the open window. The air smells like magnolia and ash. And on my desk, the parchment glows faintly under the lamp. The last line, now written in new ink, reads, "You've told it now. Rest." But even as I whisper those words, I know the story isn't over. Because outside, through the fog, I see him, walking the riverbank, slow, steady, endless. Josiah still walks.